This video is going to be broken down into 4 parts. We're going to talk about the deadly test day sins that you want to make sure you are avoiding, otherwise they can easily tank your entire SAT. We're going to talk about some really simple timing guidelines, which are going to help keep you on pace and let you control the pace and not feel overwhelmed as you're working through the sections. We're going to talk about some really simple strategies that you can use as you practice, so you're going to get a quicker feedback loop and you're going to be able to improve as quickly as possible. And the fourth and final part is I'm going to give you guys a ton of detailed content and strategies that are going to be the most impactful and the most commonly tested elements of the different sections, so you can really focus on the parts which are going to help you be able to improve your score as much as possible. Let's run through some really simple pacing guidelines to make sure you guys are able to finish the entirety of the test. You're never going to lose points for guessing, but the biggest place students lose points is mismanaging the time and not even getting to see a lot of the questions. Now, the reading section is going to be 65 minutes long. It's going to be made up of 5 passages. So you're going to have 13 minutes per passage. Now, there is one deadly sin that we'll talk about a little bit later on that most students make, which completely messes them up on the reading. But knowing that you want to be hitting the 13-minute marks as you work through the different passages can give you a really easy way of keeping yourself on pace. Now, the other thing I want you all doing in the reading section is skipping over the historical document passage. It's going to look something like this or this. Once you see it, it's almost always from the 1700s or 1800s. Skip over it and come back to it at the end. Otherwise, it's really easy to get sucked into this passage and run out of time on your 5th passage. Now, writing and language is pretty simple. You get 4 passages and you're going to have 35 minutes overall. So you're going to get 8 minutes and 45 seconds per passage. Same thing here. We'll talk about kind of one of our deadly sins later on, which can mess us up here. But additionally, with the writing and language, if you get behind time, just start skipping over some of those paragraph modification questions or trying to answer them a little bit quicker, so you can make sure you can see as many of the easier and shorter questions that you can pick up as you're working through. And if you have time left over, you can always circle back to those. Now, for the math sections, there is not as much of a strict timing guideline, but the most important thing here is don't sit on any particular question. Make sure you're able to see all the questions, and this is going to show you where you're going to get your most difficult questions in the no calculator section and the calculator section as well. So just make sure if you get to those and you're stuck, move on, because the questions will reset in difficulty in the free response. So let's make sure we get to see all of those easy and medium questions before we really worry about those hard questions if math isn't your thing. Now let's talk deadly test day sins. These are the things that can really start to tank your test and make you look back at a test and get frustrated wondering why in the world you did that. Now, the first one is getting stuck on a question. And this happens really commonly for students on the reading section as well as the math section. As you are working through reading passages, if you get to a question and you have no idea where it is, or you feel really overwhelmed and you can't seem to figure out the answer, move through the rest of the questions in the passage, come back to it at the end, and then if you're up against that 13-minute timeline, take your best guess and move on. But if you have a little bit of time left over, it becomes way easier to spend the amount of time you have, try to figure out that question, and then move on. The worst thing that can happen is you spend 5 or 6 or 7 minutes on one question, and then you look up at the clock and you realize you are so far behind where you should be, and we start to panic, and the whole section can really snowball out of control. Now, same thing goes for math. If you feel overwhelmed on a question, we now know where those more difficult questions appear. Go ahead and move on forward, come back to it at the end, then you can more comfortably spend your time there. Now, our deadly sin that really occurs only in reading and writing and language is second guessing yourself. Now, this really occurs when students pick an answer initially, then this little voice in the back of your head starts saying, well, maybe it could be this because of like this and this and this and this reason. As soon as you start feeling like you're selling yourself on an answer choice, you're doing what I call storytelling to my students, where you're adding all these different features that maybe could contribute to the answer choice being right, you're probably falling for one of the traps on the SAT. Answer choices have to be really objectively right versus wrong. So if you do not have a black and white reason for picking it, do not pick that answer choice, trust your gut, and do not change your answers you're going through. Now, the last thing you want to avoid is not answering the question. And I know most of you are probably like, well, of course I'm answering the question, but the SAT is a sneaky, sneaky test. Especially on the math section, all the time students will answer for stuff like X when the SAT is asking you for 4X or X plus 4, questions like these. It's always a great habit when you get sucked into a longer math question to make sure you reread that last sentence before you move on, so you don't end up having done 90% of the work and then just stopping one step short. Now, with a short period of time heading into an SAT, we want to make your practice as quick and feedback loop intensive as possible. What I mean by that is we want to make sure you're learning from your mistakes and getting to apply practice after you've learned from those mistakes. So with reading, what I recommend to do is 13-minute drills with one passage on an SAT practice test, review it before going to the next. Really lets you start to improve your strategy, your pacing, understanding right versus wrong. And when you're reviewing those questions, you get to think exactly what your thought process was, so you start to correct that heading to the next passage. Same thing with writing and language. Work through a passage, grade it up, review any of the questions you missed or felt iffy on, learn from those mistakes, and move forward. Now, with SAT math, you are far better off using SAT math books or SAT math resources and really just drilling into the portions that you're particularly struggling with. But if you've been taking full-length practice tests, it's also really helpful to go back and review those old mistakes you've made, because the SAT is a really consistent test. So looking back at the mistakes you've made can help you make sure you're avoiding those on test day. Now here comes the bombshell of information of the most commonly tested topics and the places after working with thousands of students where you can really start to improve your score as quickly as possible. For reading, what we want to make sure we have mastered is time management, a strategy that lets you effectively work through the passages and make sure you're retaining the information and feel comfortable understanding what's making answer choices right versus wrong, and dealing with those paired evidence questions, which can make up as much as 35% of the questions you'll deal with on the SAT. Now, for writing and language, the big challenge for most students here is they're just doing what looks right or sounds right. But there's really objective rules that the SAT has to follow for right versus wrong answers. So this is going to break down all of the different types of grammar rules that you have to know, as well as how and what you're looking for those more stylistic rules, as well as the types of questions that deal with paragraph modification that you have to be comfortable with and familiar with how to solve those types of questions. Now, SAT math is a behemoth of a subject. There is a ton of stuff that can show up on single tests and then not show back up for an entire year. But what this is going to do is break down the 2 types of test tricks you want to make sure you're familiar with, and then the 7 most commonly tested topics and all of the subtopics within those, which you want to make sure you are familiar with, because these are the things that show up by far the most consistently on the SAT. So these are the places with a short period of time that you can really cram in and you can make a decent impact. Now, you can absolutely go through the internet and find resources on these, but I also have put together a crash course which really just boils down into a handful of hours all of that really important information that you have to know. So in a really short period of time, you can go through and learn and really start to improve on the SAT. Now, if this video helped you out, please like and subscribe. If you guys have any questions heading into test day, drop them in the comments below.